everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by my friends over at a company called Real Mushrooms, realmushrooms.com. Sky Chilton and his father, Jeff Chilton. I interviewed Jeff a number of episodes ago. Really interesting guys. I really enjoyed that conversation with Jeff. And it's a company that sells and distributes medicinal mushrooms in powder or capsule form. I was really happy to have these guys come on. I think they were very much in alignment with the values of the podcast. As you all know, a big part of this podcast is about plant medicine, holistic medicine, and I think the benefits of medicinal mushrooms are truly fantastic, and I think there's really a growing body of work that's really showing and alluding to all of the amazing properties that mushrooms have. They sell a lot of different mushrooms, things you've probably heard of, like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. Those are all mushrooms I work with. They're part of what I consider for myself a really holistic supplement regime. And the thing I really love about their company, not only are they really good guys, I think they're really ethical guys, but the product is really amazing. It's all 100% mushrooms. They're organic, and that's really rare. For better or for worse, the supplement industry is highly unregulated, and so often when you get supplements, you don't necessarily know what you're getting. You may be getting some mushroom, you may be getting a bunch of fillers and other things. Oftentimes, even when you're buying what may be a mushroom, it may not have any of that mushroom in it at all, unfortunately. Even some of the big, I think even the biggest company that sells mushrooms, actually it's not the fruiting body, not the mushroom itself. It's the mycelial, which is grown on grain, and then those things are mixed up and then sold in a supplement form. So not only you're not getting the mushroom itself, you're getting the mycelium mixed with grain. So it's one of the amazing things at Real Mushrooms is it's exactly that. It's real mushrooms. So it's 100% mushrooms, organic. So you're getting a really good product. You're getting the actual fruiting body, the mushroom itself, 100% of that. And again, just really great guys. I'm really happy to have them on and supporting this podcast. So if you'd like a really good product, you'd like to start working with medicinal mushrooms, check out their site, realmushrooms.com. And also listeners of this show, if you go to their site, realmushrooms.com/universe, you get 25% off your first order, which is a really good deal. And I think once you start working and tasting their products, you'll really see and feel a big difference. So thank you to them. And I think that's it. And without further ado, here is the intro to the show. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Dr. Moshe Daniel Block. Moshe's a really interesting guy. He is a functional medicine doctor. Amongst many other things, he's done a lot of, I think, studying of alchemical principles, esoteric traditions, functional medicine, homeopathy, I think just religion and spirituality in general. So it was really a pleasure to sit down and speak with him. We spoke about, I think, a bunch of different topics, from healing and health to different types of medicine, to the mind, to spirit, to the nature of viruses, to the COVID pandemic. So it was a very varied conversation. We unfortunately only had 2 hours, but I think we easily could have gone for another 2. So hopefully we'll have him back on. But it was a really, I think, beautiful and enlightening conversation. And so I think and hope you all will get a lot from this episode. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good way. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, to all of the people supporting that way, to all of the patrons, thank you very much for your help. It always means a lot. I really like the idea of websites like that because they're based on this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's a really beautiful way to give back. Also, and finally, if you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Merav Artzi, probably by the time this is published and released, we still have 2 upcoming plant medicine dietas in Europe that we have planned. I believe April 21st in Portugal and July 1st in Ireland. And at the time of recording, we still have spaces open. So that's a really beautiful way to go deeper into plant medicine work, plant spirit work, which we really emphasized a lot during this interview, is really connecting in the realm of spirit. So if you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So I think that's it for the intro. I hope this finds you all well, and without further ado, here's my conversation with Moshe.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. We were chatting a little before we started. I would imagine that there's probably some people listening who have heard of you. Maybe they've listened to some other podcasts where you've been on. You've done a number of podcasts. But I'd also imagine a lot of people are not familiar with you. So always to start, and I know it's a big question, but if you can just give our listeners a little bit of background about yourself, who you are, the work that you do, and again, it's a big question, but kind of your life's journey that's brought you to the place that you are right now.
Sure. Yeah, okay. Well, so my name is Dr. Moshe Daniel Block. I was born and raised in Canada. And 3 years ago, I moved here to the US. I'm living in Tennessee now. There was some really crazy stuff that was going on during COVID. So we we fled the country kind of thing. I was raised in Montreal. I grew up in the 70s as a kid, and I was sick a lot. I was always sick. Thank God I had a mom who was very open. And during the 70s, it wasn't like today you can look online or look on your local area and find homeopaths, naturopaths, herbalists. You could find a whole slew of practitioners. But in the 70s, it was rare. As I was getting sick a lot, my mom would take me on a train for 5 hours to Toronto from Montreal and to get to a homeopath to help me with asthma. I had recurrent asthma, strep throat, bronchitis, pneumonia. I had all kinds of weird things. Plus, I was breaking a lot of bones when I was a kid, getting into a lot of injuries. So there was some suffering with that. I did feel like I would like to help people so they didn't have to be sick. Like I was always sick. So that was one thing. I also did, we were kind of chatting before, like you had some mystical experiences when you were young, and I did as well, where I would see energy. I would feel a flow of chi in my body. I didn't know what it was. I had no context for it. I actually thought I might be a wizard because I didn't know what it was. Nobody talked about this. I was seeing something special. That was the only possible framework that I had until I read a book on ninjutsu. And they talked about ki, and they talked about the flow of ki in the body, the Japanese term for chi, right? So I thought, oh, I must be a ninja. I mean, just whatever I could find the context of. And then I read the book, Barbara Brennan's book, Hands of Light, when I was 15 years old, and that put everything into context. She was a scientist and a medium, what do you call those, medical intuitive, very, very psychic, and was able to perceive the levels of the auric field, and that really put stuff into context. So I thought I would become a healer, a hands-on healer. I did study with her for a week and I learned so much, but I ended up going into naturopathic medicine because I like I like the balance of the scientific, we'll call it the West, and then the East, nature cure and acupuncture and homeopathy and stuff like that. It's not typically only East, but you know what I mean, like left and right brains kind of thing. And so then I became a naturopathic doctor. And right before I became a naturopathic doctor, I had a big experience with illness. It was the biggest I had ever experienced. It was with an autoimmune disease called myasthenia gravis. And that's where the muscles, the nerves are blocked. Like all the immune cells coat the muscle receptors for the signals from the nerves, so the muscles don't fire, and there's paralysis basically. And I was pretty severely paralyzed. I had difficulty getting up out of a chair. I had droopy eyelids, difficulty swallowing, total paralysis of shoulders and arms. Um, and so I was quite sick, and I tried many different things. A lot of the latest things for autoimmune and myasthenia gravis, and nothing helped. Maybe marginally, maybe like up to 5%, 10%. And then I went to this place called the Options Institute in the United States, in Massachusetts. It's the home where they work with autistic kids that have been injured from childhood with vaccines, and that's mostly why kids are getting autism these days. But in the 70s, their child this is Barry Neil Kaufman and Samaria Kaufman. This is their center. He was severely autistic, and the options for autism were terrible in the 70s. They were tying kids together by ropes and throwing them in dark closets to like isolate them, and like they were shocking, and it was horrible. It was like torture for these kids. So they just spent a 2.5 years just sitting with their child, mirroring him, whatever he did, they did. And slowly he came out of his autistic state, and he ended up with a near genius IQ. So they developed this whole center around that, and then around teaching about belief systems. And I had no idea what that really meant. Like, oh yeah, I believe this about that, but I had no idea what it really meant. And about half an hour or an hour into this program that I went to, my life was changed. It was like I had found a home that I didn't know about. And then I had my own dialogue done, which is what Barry Neil Kaufman teaches in this program. And I had a spontaneous healing when I had my own belief system revealed. And the belief that I was carrying was I needed to be perfect. I had never thought that wasn't true. I had never had that challenged. So when I discovered that was a false belief and I didn't need it, I had a spontaneous healing, and my muscles filled with strength. My eyes cleared up. I could breathe. My legs were strong. And it was because of this cascade. So in my mind, I needed to be perfect. And if I wasn't, I would punish myself energetically, emotionally, like, chastising myself. And so I was attacking myself. And then that's what showed me the connection between the mind and the body. That my body was just doing what my mind was doing. There's nothing wrong with the body in chronic illness. It's simply doing what it's being shown by the master in the house, right? I was the master in the house going, you're bad for not being perfect. So then the cells were attacking myself as a reflection of me attacking myself. And this is what I see. This is how I work with people to help them understand what their body is manifesting as a result of their false beliefs. There's a book called A Course in Miracles, which I imagine you have heard of. And there's a quote in it that I use in my training, because I do train practitioners in how to do what I do, and we could talk a little bit about that later if it flows right. And the quote is, "Only the mind is capable of error. The body can act wrongly only when it is responding to misthought." So that's what I see. I see the body as being a faithful puppy dog for the mental emotional field. You say bad dog, it'll feel and act like a bad dog, whatever that means for the individual. And you say good dog, or you don't even say good dog, you just say okay dog, and the dog will be okay, the body will be okay. So that this sort of part of my background, I've always been very interested in deep spiritual exploration, and I have used all different means for that, including what your channel is pretty big in, medicines, sacred medicines and stuff like that. And I've used a lot of homeopathy for the transformation of consciousness, meditation. I'm initiated into Kriya Yoga, and just have a lot of love for these kinds of things. I practice and study alchemy as well, and it all kind of plays beautifully together. Like the entrance point, the opening of the door from one path edifies and supports the understanding and the opening of doors in other paths as well. Provided that they're tapped into the universal, then the universal is the truth is the truth is the truth. So you get it from different angles. Yeah, man.
Yeah, amazing. There's a lot we can get into there. I think
Sure.
luckily we're maybe doing this conversation at an opportune time to where on YouTube, a couple of the points you mentioned, maybe COVID and vaccines, we can actually have an open conversation without getting censored, which I think is a big step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, a lot of stuff I'd like to get into. One of the interesting things you mentioned a lot of fields that you study and how they kind of all tie together, and I think it's more of a modern phenomena where we do have more of a reductionist thinking where we do separate fields into different categories. So a medical field is one thing, spirituality is something else, yoga is something kind of somewhat different from that. But when we speak of medicine, you mentioned you're a naturopathic doctor. I think a lot of people have heard of that. They may be familiar with it. I think a lot of people don't have a deeper understanding of what that is. And also when we say doctor, I think people inevitably think of a guy or a gal in a white coat in a hospital. They're thinking more of that allopathic system. And for them, that is a doctor. And even to think about things in a different way is a real shift of our cosmovision, to think that there could be other forms of doctors. And yet again, in the vast majority of human existence, what a doctor was very much tied to what you were speaking about as well. Like the difference between mind, body, and spirit were not seen as necessarily separate components. It was all seen as a holistic form of healing.
Right.
So maybe could you just speak a little bit about what a naturopathic doctor is? Like what are the principles? How does that differ from maybe what we would say traditional or allopathic medicine is?
Yeah, for sure. Well, naturopathic doctor, it's a 4-year, very intense study. It with a lot of the scientific, traditional, conventional medical model training, like pathology, differential diagnosis, microbiology, and then a lot of science like physiology, and we do biochem, and we do all this stuff. Not as intensely as conventional medical doctors, but the training is quite intense. And then we learn different modalities like acupuncture, botanical medicine, chiropractic, herbal. I said botanical, homeopathy, and there are others that different colleges will have different modalities. So those are the modalities that are held under a philosophy with different tenets. And the philosophy of naturopathic medicine is, first of all, do no harm, and that's the same as conventional medicine, although can't say that they're so good at that aspect very often. Do no harm. Um, Especially because I feel like even if you don't actively do harm, there is harm in suppression of symptoms. And generally speaking, the conventional model is all about addressing symptoms at the level of the symptoms and not going deeper. So there is a form of harm, even if the symptoms go away and the person's like, oh yeah, that drug totally took care of the symptoms. But there's a form of harm with that. We could get into that. It's quite interesting. And then naturopathy also includes um, doctor as teacher, treat the root cause, address the fundamental cause of illness, the fundamental cause, and we could talk about that too. In my understanding, that's the mind. The mind is actually the fundamental cause in the vast majority of chronic illness. Acute illness is a little different, and then things requiring emergency medicine. Although the mind is always involved, so there's something to be said about that. So for me, the fundamental cause, and I hear this word all the time, root cause treatment. And functional medicine doctors will be using that term a lot, but they're still material based. They're still looking at the material as the cause of the illness. So gut dysbiosis, which is material, low stomach acid, lack of nutrition, stuff like that. So it's all material causes that they're calling the fundamental cause. But for me, like what I've seen in my practice for 25 years and my own experience, I see the cause as being in the mental emotional field. And then the body is a reflection of that. So that's another principle of naturopathic medicine: address the fundamental cause, and then treat each person as an individual. It's another principle, and treat each person, the whole person. And the whole person, is acknowledged in naturopathic medicine. A lot of these things are paid lip service to, and I say that because the colleges have been taken over by the material-based agenda, by the what's credible in conventional science's eyes. There is not a lot that's left in the naturopathic programs. There are a couple of exceptions of the colleges that are still maintaining naturopathic principles, but in general speaking, there's been a departure from these root philosophies that are still taught, like in first year in philosophy class, but then they're not really applied. So that's a shame, because naturopathy is a beautiful, beautiful profession. And, the practitioners, after getting out, they're free to practice as, within a certain framework. And many of them will start to deepen their practices and work with a much more holistic approach, the whole person, addressing the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. But generally speaking, we do see a lot of material-based approaches in the major forms of medicine that are available predominantly in the West. And even in the East, East has been kind of taken over by this Ahrimanic, material-based only medicine. Conventional medicine, obviously. Functional medicine, yes. Even though it's working with deeper and more intelligent principles, that includes a larger perspective than just treating the symptoms. You're looking at diet, you're looking at the gut and things like that. This is good. Quality of the blood and nutrition, it's good. It's better. Still material. And then you have naturopathic medicine, which is broken up into different camps. You have the material-based doctors, who are basically green allopaths, using botanical medicines with pharmacological principles rather than pharmaceutical drugs. And the difference is significant, but it's still the same principle. Most pharmaceutical drugs are derived from plants anyway. They just concentrate the active ingredient from the plant and have, you could have different doses of that, but they're very concentrated. And because you don't get the full spectrum of the plant when you're taking the herbal, and by the way, you're not getting the full spectrum, but you're getting a more full spectrum, then this concentrated active ingredient could kind of cause some side effects, right? So that's also in naturopathic medicine, this camp of the material based. And then you have all kinds of naturopathic doctors who recognize the vital force, who work with homeopathy a lot, and will work with counseling, and will work with, even if they use herbal medicine, they can use the energetic principle of the plant, not just the pharmacological action on the physical body, right? Because the plants can influence the emotional field, the mental field, and things like that. So that's sort of like a breakdown of naturopathy and comparing and contrasting with the other fields as well.
Yeah, great. So it's interesting. I mean, in a lot of more traditional medicine systems, as you said, there's obviously a recognition of the material, but very often in the Western medical model, as you said, that the material is seen as the kind of the primary force, that everything can be boiled down to a material level. It's a chemical imbalance, an excess of something, a deficiency of something. But usually in these more traditional models, they also view this, what I think is also being recognized as more of a mind-body connection. But there's also this idea of spirit, of soul, which you kind of alluded to, even
Yeah.
with plants, like as you said. I mean, in the material realm, plants were the predominant materium that was used for healing. I mean, and as you said, even modern day pharmacological medicine is still something like 70% plant derived.
Yes.
Um, but even when we speak of things like psychology, I mean, because psychology usually, when we're speaking maybe of allopathic medicine, we're looking at more of the physical. Psychology could be related more to the mental emotional. But even that word psyche is very interesting because the Greek etymology of it actually means breath or life or soul. So even built into that idea was something beyond the physical and even the mental emotional. It was also alluding to a life force, to an energy, to us beyond simply being primary matter. And so in a lot of these more traditional or indigenous societies, they actually have kind of an inverse view, which is the physical is the lowest rung of the medicine. It's the byproduct. You're talking about root. It's the byproduct of when other steps are out of place. When the mind or the emotions are out of place, eventually a physical manifestation will come. But the mind or body being out of place even originates in something more primary, which is the soul or the spirit. So when you're speaking of energetics of plants or just medicine in general, is that something you can elaborate more on? Because I think there is more now of a recognition, at least of a mind-body connection. But I think that idea of an energetics or a soul or a life force. You mentioned even that idea of martial arts with this idea of ki or chi or prana, this life energy. I mean,
Yes.
that is really something that's still seen as something quite, woo-woo or new agey. And yet, if you look at all these indigenous systems, they are speaking about something in those regards, that there is something even more primary to the physical or the mental emotional that's actually vital in the health or the wholeness of a human being.
Yes. Absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. This is one of my favorite topics. So when we look at the full, treating the whole person, you could say, like, let's say a ship sinks and they say 100 souls perished, right? They call people souls. And I think we are predominantly soul. So there's the soul, which is the isness of creation. It's is. Even calling it creation is a bit of a misnomer because it is, was, and will always be. And this is the found if all that is has always been, and here we are, well then we are essentially in our core, in the root, we are that. We are that. And that's a big path in Advaita Vedanta and Taoism. Like, I love those pathways of understanding because they've really, over thousands of years, hammered this principle out and are able to convey it generously and thoroughly for our edification, to understand who we are and our essence. So we are that pure consciousness, which is. It is. It never wasn't. And it blows the mind. Sometimes I'll chat with my kids. We'll be laying in bed and they'll go, Daddy, who created God? And I love that question. And you know what? I think it's a mystery that we could really only experience, but I like to talk about it. And I think the answer there is the answer, I think, is God has always been. That's what blows the mind, because the mind is finite in nature. It grasps objects. It doesn't understand pure beingness. That's beyond the mind. So the first nature of our essence is this pure beingness. And then comes the manifest worlds. And in yoga, they're called Maya, like the name of the body. Maya is appended to it because that means illusion. So the that which is true is that which is, was, and always will be, and never cannot not be, right? So then we have these different bodies that this consciousness inhabits, and those different bodies make us the individual souls that we are. So we have the causal body, which is pure potentiality, incredibly powerful. It's the first created matter, the first begotten being. In the causal world, because we could break this down into the four worlds of Kabbalah and even the four worlds of yoga. The highest level of manifestness is this causal plane. It's the world of Bria. And in that world, the Christ sits on the throne. You could say it's the marriage of opposites, the Tao. This is the place of the Tao where the opposites are married. And then we have the lower body. So we have the higher intellect, which is known as Vijnana Maya Kosha. Again, Maya, this illusion, but it's still something created. And then we have the deep subconscious mind, which is the dwelling place of the emotional field, and where the belief forms become stored in the subconscious. It's the subconscious called Manomaya Kosha. And then we have, this is the vital level now. It's called Pranamaya Kosha, the vital body. Now, it's actually a lower form than those other three bodies, the causal, the higher intellect, and then the subconscious. Then you have the vital. And this is sometimes referred to as the etheric. It could be seen as a vital energy around the body. Some people will perceive this sort of thin auric field layer as like a blue light. I have been able to perceive that from time to time. Funny enough, when I was a hockey player, I could see it on the ice because you'd have this white ice and you'd have these players and the referees, I could see their auric field around the white ice. It's kind of neat. You wouldn't expect that, and then you have the physical plane, the physical matter. And what's interesting, these great scientists, like even Max Planck and Einstein and Nikola Tesla, they say that what we perceive as matter is not even matter. So even though when we get to this the lowest form of the body, there is nothing that is matter per se. It's all the way that the interplay between the different bodies in the mind perceiving a lower or denser, slower vibrational form of energy, right? Because I'm sure with with all your experience in plant medicine, you could see through the physical. You could see the transparent nature of the physical world. And so, but it is very obvious to us when we are in our lower mind that's very attached to the five senses, right? When we're in the five senses, then we're really this physical, this body, this is who I am. Because look, I'm doing this, and that must be me. But the vital force, in my understanding, it's comprised of all these subtle bodies. It's the dynamic between them. And when the mind is at peace and still and observing what is, which is stillness, then the emotional field is full of the joyousness of that which is. And then the vital force is just lit up with creative life force. It's all flowing. And then the body, the flow of chi moves the flow of blood and the breath, and it all gets full of life energy. So the body's in a good place. When the mind chooses to believe something incorrect, it's actually working in opposition with the nature of reality. It's trying to usurp the throne, so to speak, or come over the top and grab onto control and say, this is true. So the mind will form a false belief. Let's say I'm unlovable, or I'm never good enough, or I'm not okay with how I look, or I'm stupid. Whatever these beliefs are that the mind fixes onto, that energy that we hold onto becomes a point of stagnation of the flow. And then the emotional field will reflect in a very similar way, in its own emotional way, we will feel whatever the belief system has designated as truth. So I will feel I'm not good enough if I believe that. And that's what's tough about this earth plane of existence, that the emotional field doubles down on the mental field, and it creates a seemingly real experience of a false belief. Because if we only just thought, then you felt great, you would be like, well, I don't really need that thing. Like, that's not true. You'd sort of brush it away. But because of the emotional doubling down, it really has the appearance of truth. And then we triple down into the body, where the body will crystallize the form of blockage in the mind and the emotion. Then the body will hold that same pattern in its body way. So not good enough will be, well, I'm weak, or I'm always tired, or whatever it is that the body shows. For me, attacking myself was autoimmune, because that's the part of the body that has this attack thing, attack foreign particles or attack the self. So we get this very strong, tripling down of the false belief. And when I work with people, there's when the disease is very embedded in the body, then they have this feedback loop that they'll say, that will really hold them to the pattern that they really have to take a kind of a step out of, because they'll say, well, like, let's say the belief is I am weak, but then the body is actually weak. So then when I say, okay, what's holding that pattern for you? They'll say, well, I'm weak. My body's weak, so I am weak. And so that's a very tricky trap in the mind. So the mind is going to confirm itself. The false beliefs are going to confirm by the system of the body. So that requires some very subtle maneuvering and explanation to help the person kind of get out of that. So yeah, this is just a way I perceive this, how it operates in the body. It's just an overview, because I'm sure we could hammer out some of the points quite a bit.
So yeah, that's fascinating. I think a lot of people are familiar with that idea of belief systems and how that can impact the organism, the human organism. I don't know how many people truly, though, it's one thing to maybe intellectually understand something. It's another thing to embody something. I remember my main teacher in the jungle. He was a tabacero, someone who specialized in the medicine of tobacco. But I found it very fascinating, because sometimes people would come to him with very deep illnesses, very deep sicknesses, chronic diseases, cancers, things that in more of a Western medical model were either incurable, or the success rate is quite low. And it was always very interesting, because the first thing he would always emphasize them is, you have to believe that you're not sick. And I thought that was very, very interesting, and it resonated. But it also, I think, took me a long time to really begin to understand that on a deeper level. And as you said, I think there's a few things at play there. One, it goes back to this idea of identity. Once we attach to an identity of I am this, I am the sick person, as you said, it begins to feed a loop. But also, as I think you were pointing to in this idea of chronic illness, it's also potentially not understanding what's happening. Again, it's saying that something is bad, that something is off, potentially, rather than there's simply a reaction to something that's happening, and that can actually be a gateway or a key to actually being able to overcome this thing. So if we get in a loop of there's something wrong, I'm sick, there's no cure, there's no way out, this is who I am, then it's perpetuating a feedback loop that's very difficult to break. I think the other thing that's very difficult for people to maybe grasp with that, and I think something that would be interesting to hear your thoughts on, is I think some people then take that as something that if there is an illness, it means that I did something wrong. And I think that's also a very difficult thing for people to grasp with because it means and again, this is very tricky, because on the one hand, we are responsible for our lives. At the other hand, it's a very like Christian principle, which is forgive them because they know not what they did. We
Right.
can't be responsible for what we don't realize as well. But there can become an interesting dynamic where people then they can use that to say, well, you're blaming the person for their disease,
Right.
which there is something that's important of not blaming them because again, it's alluding to the fact that they had a choice on that, where the reality is most likely they didn't have a choice because their mind or their evolution, no one would choose to be ill. So there's something that they didn't necessarily have a volition for, but that they've reached a point where now they do have a volition for that, which is why the illness is potentially there. So I know that's kind of a big subject, but I'd just be interested to hear some of your thoughts around that.
Yeah, it's a great subject. So, talking about these whenever we talk about truth, we have to, and I feel like it's crucial to understand the Hermetic principle. All truths are half truths. Now that is mind-boggling. And I'd like to delve into that a little bit because it sets a good foundation for exactly what we're discussing here. Because of the nature of the universe, like so we have, like we talked about a little bit, the four worlds. So the physical world is the physical world. Then you have the astral. And in the astral are the subtle bodies. And the subtle bodies in yoga are considered like the mind, the emotion, and the vital. Those are the three bodies of the subtle world. And the operating principle is the principle of correspondence, of opposites, of yin and yang, of masculine and feminine, of soul and luna, the sun and the moon, opposites, to quote alchemy. So because of the nature of creation being opposite, when our mind settles on a truth, it's always from one perspective. It could be the masculine perspective or the feminine perspective. At, but because we're on one perspective, that's true. It is true. But then there's a counterpart which seems to neutralize or oppose, in the sense that negate the opposite, but it's not a negation. It is the nature of creation being made up of these opposites that calls us to expand our awareness into accepting the half truth here and the half truth there. And when they marry, when the sun and the moon marry, they create the child. And I was talking about the Christ being the first begotten being, which is in the causal world. And the Christ is, it's a Christian term, but it's really a universal principle. It could be called the Tao. It could be called the great child of creation. It doesn't have to be specifically Christian. Although I do appreciate and resonate with the Christ as a word, right? So then we're talking about half truths. So exactly what you're saying, you're subtly bringing and introducing these half truths. So it is a half truth to say, well, we were innocent and we had no idea as a child that that was a mistake. But it was still a mistake. Because who we really are is beyond that. So when we choose to identify with these false beliefs, it's a mistake, even though it's an error in innocence. So there's a principle of error in innocence. But then as you move forward with that error in innocence, it is a perpetuated error that we continue to make on a subtle level, which we're very often not even aware of. So again, there's this, don't blame the person because they're unaware. They know not what they do. But nevertheless, there's an invitation to recognize the error that is going on. And here, this is a beautiful balance, a beautiful dance of opposites. So, and it's also empowering to recognize that inside of our subconscious mind, there is this point, this place of pure empowerment, pure ability to be healed and heal ourselves. So I like to look at it instead of saying, "Oh, we're blaming someone." I like to sort of like redirect into, "Well, you have the power to heal." Right. So, and also that whole spiel I just gave about the error and innocence, like when we're children, like there's very few. I have had quite some through the years of practice where the child was aware, there's something wrong with mom or something wrong with dad or both of them. And they were aware that the way they were acting was weird. And they were aware that they were going to make a choice about that to pacify their parents or to satisfy them or to just avoid the big blow up that would come if they remained true to themselves. So there was always that potential in the child to know the truth and nevertheless to choose a false path to mitigate, to satisfy, to pacify, to avoid the conflict because it was easier for them. And it's understandable for a child going through, a kind of hell in their family because their parents were wounded and their parents were wounded too, and their parents, and so on and so forth. So we have this thing that helps us survive, that we can latch onto. Let's say one of the parents is abusive. Doesn't make sense to the child. Like, I love you. Like, how could you be abusive? It doesn't compute. And what I've seen, one of the most common things I've seen is that the child when they can't wrap their head around something, what they can wrap around is what they believe about it. And what they believe about it that they could control is themselves. They can't control the parent. So because they can't wrap their mind around this abusive, not loving nature, they say it must be me. I'm the one to blame. And so so often I'll get to the bottom of a suffering point, the chronic illness, the mental, emotional suffering, we'll get to this point where I'm bad. And it's a liberation point. It's a point of release for them to realize that they chose to believe that because they didn't understand how their parents could be that way. So in a way, they have to put the onus on the parents for being in error. You could do that with compassion, but you still have to do that firmly. And then they could say, you know what? I realize that I made myself wrong because I didn't understand. And that's a big point of liberation, really big point.
How big of a role do you think that plays in illness? Because I think there is something very true about that Hermetic principle of all truths are half truths, and I think that example you gave is a really common thing that people struggle with. It's often said that wisdom is being able to hold two truths at the same time. And I think that example is very pertinent. I mean, because, especially in our more modern medical system, especially with psychiatry, psychology, there is a lot of emphasis on trauma, on childhood trauma. And I think that's really one of the key points is this idea, because we tend to say, my parent was bad. And then that takes on a whole world, a whole cosmovision that we then build our lives around. And it's very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to hold those two things to be true, where, yes, my parent they did bad things, potentially even they abused me, and at the same time, there was a loving aspect to them. There was a caring, there was a wholeness. You even use those ideas of like masculine and feminine principles, and I think there's a lot of resistance to that. There's a lot of resistance to duality because we can take anything that's an exception to that and then say, well, that negates the idea of duality. Like, for example, we can say as a truth, people have 5 fingers on one hand. That's why when you go to a store, they sell gloves and those gloves have 5 fingers. And yet, there are people who have 6 fingers. There are people who have 4 fingers. And so that's also a truth. But it's also a truth that people have 5 fingers. And you mentioned something really interesting when you were speaking about this idea of belief systems and chronic ailments. And even in your own case, you said, the mind believes something that's incorrect. And that incorrect belief is creating an illness. But that also entails that then there is a correct belief system. And I think that's something that people really struggle with, which is that deciphering of what is real, what is false, you use that word Maya, illusion. Like, what is an illusion? What is seeing beyond that illusion? And there's always this dualistic nature in that too. And I think it's really important to name the real, to recognize the real. And as you said, that all truths are also have truths. And so finding that balance. But that seems to be, and maybe it's the eternal struggle of the human being, but finding that balance. I mean, even like from a Buddhist perspective, it is that middle way, which I think is being alluded to. But I think that's really difficult for people because we do like to look at the world as very black and white. It is this or it is this. And that's even part of our modern medical system, is this more reductionist system. Like, you only have to focus on one thing, and it's very difficult to pull back from that and to see things in a more objective way rather than that very, very subjective way.
Yeah, wow. Very deep assertions of what you're sharing here, and very subtle discussion, very subtle, because what you're saying is right. And again, more half truths are being brought to the table to address because, so from one perspective, you could say there is only one truth, and that is beyond any definition. It can only be experienced. And there's nothing that can be said of it, which is actually encompasses the truth. So ultimately, what the rishis of India and the Taoists of China would say is that, well, it's all beyond the perception of the mind. It can only be experienced. And so if we talk about truth, we're ultimately always only speaking in half truths. And I think that's where the Hermetic masters are coming from too, Hermes Trismegistus's writings and like the Kybalion. I do believe that is truth as well. And then if we sort of, we are right now, you and I, we are in physical form. We are in a physical world. And there is a way that physical world can act in harmony with that source oneness. And there's a way that it doesn't. So from that perspective, when we're acting in harmony with, allowing, reflecting, resonating with, speaking with, and doing all these different ways, we could say, well, that resonates with truth. It's not the truth itself, because the truth is only in the essential being, but we could say it resonates with truth, and therefore it's truthful. It's full of truth. And then there's a way that we could say, well, it's not true because it doesn't resonate with, it opposes the nature of creation. And if we really want to get crazy, we could even go to the point, well, yeah, sometimes when we act that way, it's not in a truthful way, but it has purpose. It serves a purpose. It's for us to learn something. I do like the principle that even though this isness is beyond definition, I do feel like it emanates love, this nature of love. And so when we look at our behavior on the planet, love could be a kind of standard of, perhaps we could say an objective standard. Now, we do define love differently, so that does create a little bit of a problem there in some ways. But I'm sort of the mind that, when we're in a healthy state, everybody could agree. Everybody can ultimately agree on an expression of love. And if we don't, well, then we got to sit down and maybe we'll hash it out for a few months until we get to a clear point. Like the master, let's say yogi, Taoist, or Christian, or Kabbalist, or Sufi, when they sit, even though they speak very different languages, and their language or about the path to God is different, they can recognize in each other the universal. So that's where I'm coming from about the truth. Like there's emanations, there's ways of it resonating with that core truth, which is really the only truth that can only be experienced. And I see that there's a beautiful path for us to, you know, because that core truth is isness. So that's the nature of truth. And then we could say, well, is to be, that's the verb to be. And to be oneself is an important principle in health. So if I am being myself, it means I'm acting the way I love to be. I'm speaking what I love as my truth. I am feeling how I love to be. So there's this principle of beingness. It's very important for, even though there's all these different, we call lower levels of our different bodies, and there's this core truth that's beyond all that. There's an important principle of being, to be oneself, so you have a way of being which is very unique to you. It's like we're all these individual stained glass windows that the light of God is shining through. So we want to like keep that dust free and let the light come through without inhibition. So I think that's an important principle as well.
It was really beautiful. I don't know if you remember, I'm not sure I even remember the exact word, but you said something about this idea that the truth is serving nature, creation. And it reminds me of a few things. One, again, from all of these different paths, it reminded me of this idea. I think it was Swami Satchidananda. I used to, when I was living in New York, I used to do this kind of karmic yoga exchange of making food there in exchange for classes. But there was a quote on the wall that said, "Paths are many, truth is one."
Yeah.
And also, I'm from the U.S. and I have a lot of respect for the founding fathers, and I think there's this. This may be a topic we can get to more as we go on, but this kind of revisionist history that's looking at people from a modern lens, and that's very unwise, in the real sense of that, because again, much like we were speaking about illness, like we only know the world through the lens that we can see it through at that moment. And so to judge someone from a past lens I think is very unwise. But, for me, these men were amazing thinkers, amazing visionaries. But they would also speak to this idea that the highest truth was observed in nature, that nature gave you the idea of truth. Also from a completely different philosophy, I also practice martial arts, and it's often said the greatest samurai was a guy named Musashi, and he has this beautiful quote, and he says, "Reality is not what you would like it to be. It is what it is, and you must bend to its power or live a lie."
Oh,
And
shiver.
yeah.
Love it.
And finally, it reminded me. I spent a lot of time as I was mentioning before we started, in the Peruvian Amazon with a group of people called the Shipibo Canibo people. And from my understanding, a lot of their language was originally translated by Christian missionaries who, I think did a good job, but it was also from their own worldview, from their own lens. But the Shipibo have a saying, which is hakun, and they'd often say hakun natu, which they would be translated as good day. But natu actually means world or universe, and even in a deeper sense, it means this idea of time and space, this ever-present time and space, which is neither created nor destroyed. It's this eternal presence, which is also means world, but there's a lot of depth to that idea of world. And they speak of even different worlds, different natus. And hakun is translated as good. But actually, if you look at it in a deeper level, what they mean by good is actually it means that which is true. And even deeper, what that word means, more than truth, like how do they define truth? They define truth as that which is life-giving. So if something is life-giving, that means it's true. And if it's true, it means it's good. And the negation of that is ma. So hakun ma means it's not good, which means it's not true, which means it's not life-giving. It's separating. And so I think there is this kind of beautiful embedded wisdom in so many of these cultures. And I do think a lot of our suffering comes, as you said, when we don't recognize that, when we fight nature, when we fight reality. And kind of tying into to maybe my question, again, I think a big part of your work, which you've written about, is this idea of autoimmune conditions, of chronic ailments. And as you said, like our Western medical model, because again, I think there is real power in words. And I think when we negate things or when we speak badly of things, we also feed that energy. And, so even the Western medical model, like, I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan of it, but it does serve a purpose. If we are, if I'm in a car crash and my organs are destroyed and blood is pouring out of me, like I would like to go to a hospital and have them, fix me up as best they can. But certainly in terms of autoimmune conditions of chronic ailments, that model or that worldview has a very, very poor success rate, a very, very poor success rate. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, which means it's not working. Something in that cosmovision isn't working. And what you mentioned, this idea of the correlation to belief systems and autoimmune conditions or chronic ailments, is something that's very profound and I think very revolutionary. And I think it's also met with a lot of resistance because it's also not so reductionist. It's not so easy to put a number by it, to deduct it, to replicate it, because it's very much related to the human being, which is as infinite as a soul, as God. It's infinitely complex. And so it's very difficult, I think, in many ways, to reduce it to a model where we can take a pill and replicate the exact science of that for each individual, because we as individuals are so different. So can you speak a bit more about your work, about working with people with chronic ailments, with autoimmune conditions, and that idea of belief? Because I think that's such a profound thing. And I think something more people are potentially waking up to, but it's still not that accepted in the mainstream. And I think even as individuals, as you said, that there's something that's very scary about that, because it does mean that we do have power. And, interestingly, there's a beautiful quote, which is that most people, what they want is not freedom, because most people think they want freedom. But the
Right.
quote is something like, most people don't want freedom. What they want is safety. And,
Right.
and there's something very comforting in giving our power to someone else to be able to heal us and not realizing that we do have volition in our own lives.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Love it. So, building on your idea and what I had spoken about before with Hakun Nata, like I think that's what you called it. That which is true is good, and what's good is true, and what's truth is life-giving. So, again, expanding on this idea, what is not true is going to lead to illness, right? It's not the life force which animates the body and sustains the body in equilibrium and harmony is going to be depleted or blocked and not allowed to express when we're living an untruth. And you could say, well, that would define it as bad because it's leading to untruth. And I feel like what we're here for is that truth. That's the truth is central to all things because it is the nature of reality. Therefore, if we're living separated from that, then it's our task to return to that, at our own pace and as we are capable. I do I like to put the octave up a little bit. I like to put a little bit of fire under that progression because there's a lot of work to do. And we could la-ti-da with it, which is fine. We're all godly beings, so we could choose our pace. But I like to put a fire under that and accelerate it a little bit because there's a lot of work to be done. And thank God I'm in a life cycle right now where I have understanding, I have a certain amount of wisdom, so I'd like to take advantage of that as well. But here we are, we're in this life, and we are not, given we're not fully enlightened. So the illness is the opportunity, it's a crystallization of that way in which we are not living that truth. It's I don't love the word perfect because it got me into a whole bunch of trouble when I thought I needed to be perfect. But it is a kind of perfect way of our bodies, this creation demonstrating to us with feedback of suffering, saying, hey, this is exactly a crystallization of why you are separated from this hakun nata, from this inherent isness, this inherent truth. And therefore, whenever we suffer in any way, it could even be mental, emotional, we could have this knowing that there's a reason for that. And therefore, we could have this curiosity for inquiry and exploration. So that I would like everybody to have that understanding that regardless of whatever illness that they have, and there are few exceptions, and I allot for a few exceptions because I think anything is possible, but even the exceptions, like let's say one of the exceptions is, very, very heavy metal poisoning, a lot of toxicity, not minor amounts or even moderate amounts of heavy metal toxicity, which we're getting from chemtrails and in the food and, exhausts on the road and seriously heavy metal toxicity. It can sort of trump this evolutionary process and you just have to get it out of the system. But I still think, because I'm a kind of a purist in this way, that even with the heavy metal toxicity, there's still some invitation there at the mental, emotional for how we got that toxicity. Perhaps we didn't listen to ourselves when, there was a subtle feeling like, well, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I shouldn't go there. Maybe I shouldn't, smoke that, talking about like conventional cigarettes. Maybe I should, there's still the soul which is present, which is guiding the being towards goodness and life-giving nature. So there's still something of a nature, but we could say that it's so extremely overwhelming for the body that it will take over and we just have to treat it at a material, right? But other than that, these chronic illnesses that we get are the exact ways in which we are blocked in our evolution to that one, to that goodness, to the truth. And so the chronic illness becomes a messenger, a wake-up call. And very often we need that wake-up call because our egos can be very complacent and very satisfied and very apathetic in comfort, especially in our Western world, where we're very comfort-oriented. So when we're raised as comfort being central, it's not comfortable to be sick, and so it's going to push you to seek. It's not the best motivation to re-seek that comfort, but in the process of seeking to return to a place of okayness, you're going to learn a lot of things and ideally get more detached from comfort as the central principle. Because like you said, that we look for safety. We look for comfort, and these are idols that we worship. They're lower forms than the actual form, not form, but beingness itself. So yeah, that's the way I see the purpose of illness. It's a privilege. That's a half truth because it's also a major point of suffering and a pain in the butt. And I'd like to not have any symptoms ever. But if I do, there's a reason for them. And having that mindset, accepting it. Imagine if children accepted that from the beginning. Then if they started to have it, they would go right into inquiry and they could catch it as early as they could rather than decades long or years long of this, crystallization, ossification of the illness. And it becomes more difficult, not impossible. Everything is possible, but it becomes more difficult the longer we have lived with illness as a basis of our reality. to change that reality becomes a bigger leap. Yeah.
It reminded me, when I was younger in my 20s, I did a lot of traveling, and I was traveling in the north of India in an area called Sikkim, and on the journey up there by like a bus, I think the guy who I was sitting next to was a local guy, super nice, and we talked the whole journey. And when we got out, he invited me to his house, and I went to his house and I met his family, and he had these beautiful children. And I was sitting with his daughter, and she was showing me her school book. And I was so amazed. Again, I think I was very privileged. I had a beautiful education, I think a true American liberal arts education, math and science and, history and all these things, which I do think is invaluable as well. But I was looking through her book, and there was none of that. It was like, whatever, Johnny comes up to you and he says something mean to you, and you begin to experience anger. Like, where is that anger coming from? What is that? What is the emotion of that? How do you deal with Johnny? What do you say to him? What does that make you feel? And I was just thinking, like, wow, what an amazing thing. And I was looking at all these kids and these people, and they were just so happy, so content, so in the present. And, as you said, that there is something very formative, obviously, about childhood. So when someone is coming in and working with you, whether it's with a chronic disease or autoimmune condition, and again, I know it can be very varied, but what does that look like? How do you begin to work with that person, or how are you diagnosing them? How are you looking at them? How are you speaking to them? How are you working with them? What is what is the timeline of that? How does it look? Because I think that's something that a lot of people are very curious about, because more and more, as we know, like, chronic conditions are increasing.
Yeah.
And especially from the modern scientific model, there is no explanation for that.
Right.
There's a
Right.
lot of kind of theories which also seem to kind of conflict with each other. But the reality, again, going back to truth, the reality is those are increasing. So how does that
Yeah.
look like when you begin to work with someone?
Yeah, sure. So they will approach me for a session. I'll ask them about it, and ask if I like to make it very clear how I work, so that they don't come with the expectation I'm going to just fix them or give them something that's going to take away the illness without a deeper understanding. So they need to be on the same page, because the work that I do it's all about voluntary choice based. It's all choice based. So if the person is not on board or even subtly resistant, um, it's okay for them to be subtly resistant, because we can all have fear. But for them to be resistant to the idea itself, it's not going to work. So they shouldn't come to me in the first place. There's plenty of other kinds of practitioners out there. So that's the first step. And then they'll come with a condition. Um, I just had a new session yesterday. It was very interesting. There's this gentleman who had this idiopathic, meaning we don't know where it comes from, swelling in his legs. They thought it could be cellulitis, and he actually suffered with cellulitis in the past. And so we'll start there. Okay, tell me about the physical symptoms. What does it feel like? What does it look like? When did it start? What accompanies it? I call this all the nuts and bolts of the physical condition. We want to get it very clear. And I also want to hear the language of how the person experiences that. Because in the language of how it impacts them physically, is we start to hear emotional content and frustration and helplessness and different words that the person uses. And so that when we get to the root cause, we can say, aha, there's how you believe about reality. And in that language of how you believe is the crystallization of exactly what you said about how you feel about your illness or how it feels to you. So we will make a mind-body connection in that moment. And for this gentleman, he had, with this recent bout of this acute flare-up infection, the doctors don't know what the hell it is. He had a falling out with his brother. And then we also looked at, well, what happened when you had actual cellulitis? Because there's a very similar manifestation, but this time the antibiotics didn't touch it. And he had a falling out with a lady a lady girlfriend. So we have, okay, there's an interesting parallel there. So what actually unfolded was his sense of he gets a feeling of joy and connection and closeness out of these close personal relationships. And he internalizes that as part of his self. And he believes that this is part of me because this is how it feels. So he's conflating or confusing an external relationship with what it's making him feel. And so that when the relationship is broken or it ends, he feels like he's lost something of himself, which is an impossibility. But the mind latched onto those relationships for him that made him feel that he lost something, and he felt very unstable. And lo and behold, his feet and legs are swollen. And when he walks, he's hobbling around and has no stability. So his very feeling of a lack of stability, which is from his mind believing that he needs these relationships to have this sort of sense of permanent, something he could rely on, something he could depend on, it became a manifestation of illness when he believed he lost that very thing he needs in order to have something he could depend on. So his life lesson is manifesting through this physical suffering of his swelling, painful, itchy legs, but it's pointing to the very I am itself. And what the I am is calling him to do is to not conditionalize, not believe that who he is dependent on the relationship. So that's what I did. And the way I do that, I can address this as well as part of your question, is through asking questions. You know, the tagline of holistic counseling is where questions heal. The question itself causes the person to look deeper. So we start with the physical complaint. I'll say, well, what's that like for you? So we get all the nuts and bolts. And then from the nuts and bolts, I have different entry points into the rabbit hole that will lead us down into the subconscious, that will reveal what the mind pattern is fixed around, what conditionality, so that the person could see that and make a different choice. So I'll say, okay, well, what's that like for you to have this? Well, it's frustrating. Tell me about the frustration. Well, you know, I can't exercise the way I always am able to. And what does that bring up for you that you can't exercise? Well, I am a fit person. And if I'm not fit, who am I? So there we see a limitation or a conditionality around the I am. The I am is meant to be experienced unconditionally, just as it is, exactly what you said in your quote. That reality is not the way you want it, it is the way it is. And if you don't surrender to that, you're going to live a lie. Love that quote. It's so powerful. So this is what I'm doing in my practice. I'm helping a person by asking them questions, and they give me an answer, and I'm making sure they give me an answer, because a lot of people, like, you know, they squirrel away from going deeper. So my role, more than anything else, is just to make sure they answer the question. And if they don't, I bring them back. You know, puppy, paper. Come on, puppy. We got to get you back on that paper. And so that's my role. I'm asking them questions. I'm making sure that the answer is deepening and not just going off into storytelling. I want them to deepen. And then from that deeper question, I'll ask them another deeper question. And then that will deepen. And then we keep going deeper and deeper until we get into that root place where, because of the core nature of it, you could see the core as it applies across the board in their suffering. For him, the girlfriend, the loss of the girlfriend, then the loss of the relationship with his brother. And then also he actually had a loss of his ability as a very, very prominent athlete, where he had defined his stability and his dependability on his body. So it was literally a carbon copy of a core issue, but in very varying ways. We could see that core issue manifested in those different things.
It's interesting because a lot of what you're speaking about is identity, and you know, in a lot of, again, this is a bit of a generalization, but I think in a lot of maybe psychotherapeutical models, there is very much an emphasis on identity, whether it's finding your trauma, finding your archetype or your constellation system. And it seems
Yeah.
like there's a real emphasis on if I find this thing of who I am, then I will be happy, or then I will be whole, then I will be at peace. But it seems, also a bit in what we're speaking about to be potentially antithetical. Like rather than adding on layers, we're actually trying to get to the root of something to also be seen that that's not who I am rather than that is who I am.
Right. Very good point. Another brilliant point. And so what I have a book. It's called Holistic Counseling, Introducing the Vis Dialogue. And in it, I explain exactly what we're talking about, that this inherent goodness of the truth can't be defined or explained. It can only be experienced. It is non-definable. So we are trying to peel away all the conditions of definition of our identity to get to the pure I am, which is undefined. It's just simply okay. I'm okay. I am okay. I prefer the statement I am, period. But I am okay is a nice resonance. It's not like I am the best or I am perfect or I am even other things that are good. I am happy. I am loving. Not like even those are like we're appending things to this pure I amness, which is inherently okay and doesn't need to be defined beyond I am. So yes, we are, that is the foundation of recognition in my work. And if a person gets to a point where they're kind of attached to their identity in some way, a definition and therefore a conditional definition of their I am, then I'll give them a little spiel if they haven't read my book, and I'll say basically who we really are is pure beingness, pure consciousness, and that is unconditionally okay. Who we are, we're unconditionally okay. We were created as a child of God in that model of creation, and we are okay as we are. We don't need anything externally. So when we get attached to something, that's what causes the suffering. And that's the sort of seed around which suffering and illness can form. So exactly what you said, where I'm not helping a person look for an identity as in like a purpose, like I am a something. We're not looking for that. We are looking for the condition that they're attached to that is not life-giving, that is leading to their illness. And then helping them see. So first is the process of discovery, questions, asking, revealing, and getting an answer. Okay, here's the discovery. This is the problem. And then we move into resolution phase. And the resolution phase can happen all in one appointment, or it could be revealed, but then it could take many, and years of appointments to actually be ready to release it. It depends on how ingrained it is, how deep it is, and how big the trauma was. Because some people, like I've been working now with people from all over the world for 25 years. I've had my fair share of suffering, but I can't believe the degree of suffering that people have gone through in their family life, maybe at the hands of their siblings or their parents, or they lost their parents and they were in an orphanage, or their parents were certifiably insane and malicious and vindictive and tortured the child. I like the level of suffering is, in some cases horrible. And when the suffering has been compounded by repetition of abuse, it gets very strong. And so it could take multiple revisitations to that place of okayness before that person is truly ready to let go of not just the false belief that they derive from their suffering, but all the survival mechanisms, which I call tendrils, the tendrils that lock it into place. So it could be very challenging, but the potential is there in a given appointment, first discovery and then resolution to resolve that wound. And the conditionality, right? The conditionality of the I am. So I'm on the same page as you. We're looking to undo less, to do less, to hold less. It's partially why I'm not a big fan of affirmations, because when we do affirmations, we're affirming a thing. I am. And if anything, the best affirmation is I am. I am. And then, the things that are conditional around that will rise up in contrast to just saying I am. I'm something. No, I'm this. I'm this. I have to be this. I have to be respected. I have to be the best. I have to be whatever. Those are the conditions that would serve us in terms of experiencing the life-giving nature of the truth if we release them.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, two things popped up, and I think this may lead us to some big subjects. One of the things I heard you speaking about previously was this idea of like the Ahrimanic forces, the Luciferian forces. I think anyone who does work in healing, and especially maybe as you begin to not just necessarily do physical healing, but to work more with the mind, the psyche, the soul. As you said, I mean, there is a tremendous amount of suffering in the world. I mean, as you said, you will come across people who have lived very, very dark life experiences. And that kind of also gets to this idea of the nature of good and evil. And in a lot of these traditions, they do speak in those dualistic ways, that there is good and there is evil. And I think in a lot of kind of our maybe postmodern way of thinking, we don't like to recognize that. We like to say that well, everything is gray. And that is, again, part of that idea of half-truth. But again, it's also, I think, negating this more, maybe like we're speaking about Shipibo idea, that there is goodness, and goodness is life-giving. And things that are not life-giving are not good. There's an evil to that. Like, I think you would have to be either very disingenuous or maybe not have a heart to look at someone being very abusive to a child, and especially in very dark ways, and not say that that's bad, that's wrong, that's certainly not life-giving.
And just acknowledging that half-truth of it, right? We
Right.
need to acknowledge that half-truth of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And something, very interesting, I think that you mentioned, and again, so maybe it's a two-part question. One, also maybe leading into these more maybe alchemical ideas, but also something, very real. Like you mentioned, you were living in Canada and you moved away from Canada because of COVID. And I think also that's interesting because it ties into that idea about illness. Like, there was probably something in you that says, like, if I continue to stay here, like, I'm also feeding a certain illness. Like, this isn't good for me, or this isn't good for my family, and I'm choosing to leave, which is part of that act of empowerment. But it was also interesting. I heard you speaking about this in another podcast, which you were saying, like, one of the greatest threats we face today, and I very much agree, is this idea, because we were speaking about identity, and again, these like identity politics, because it is based upon this model that we were speaking about, which is I am that. And that model, while seemingly coming from a good place, like I am my skin color, I am my gender, I am my country, whatever, I am my political party, which is very, very common these days.
My religion.
My religion,
too.
yeah. While seemingly that can heal, and it's not that it can't heal, but again, it's adding another layer, and that layer very much can be, I mean, by its nature, it is separating. It's making me, and then there's a not me. There's a, whatever it is, my race, my gender, my sex, my religion. Inevitably, even if in the best intention, we are then othering anyone who's not part of that. And
Yeah.
you also mentioned something very interesting, which I think is something that's not spoken a lot of. Which also, I think you mentioned this idea of one of the greatest threats is the denial of spirit. Which is very
Yeah.
much embedded in our medical model. Which also you mentioned this idea of atheism, and I think even very much that idea of COVID was very much a product of this kind of atheistic view of the world, which is that we've lost touch with spirit or with God. We view the highest order as the rational mind of man, that's the primordial essence of knowledge, which throughout history has led to horrible, horrible outcomes, whether it's, Stalinist Soviet Union, Maoist China. It's this idea that everything, the highest order, is in the realm of man, is in the realm of rationality. And it gets us away from spirit. It gets us away from a deeper sense of our connection to nature, our deeper connection to sense of spirit, this sense of also empowerment that we do have agency over our lives, over our autonomy, over our freedom, over our bodies. And I think that's something that the pandemic, the COVID area really showed is how much fear there is, and how much we are able to relinquish our autonomy to some higher body that we trust. That supposedly can take care of us, and I think it's a very similar aspect to a lot of religion. You mentioned these practices like Advaita Vedanta or some of these maybe more esoteric practices. There tends not to be a priest or a pope or a medium, someone that only for us to be able to realize our own enlightenment or truth, we have to go through another source, which could be beneficial, but ultimately there's a disempowerment of that. So I know this is a huge question, but I guess it's fundamentally tying into this idea of maybe in a more also real sense of this idea of giving away our power, of this culture we're living in, which does identify with very specific things, and kind of this more alchemical process of these kind of archetypal battles between light and dark, and how that kind of ties into to also our health. Because I also very much see that, again, half truths are true. And yet, when we fight fundamental principles, we do suffer. And I think a lot of these views or ideologies or cosmovisions that we're being taught now are very much leading to our suffering. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize the heaviness or the weight that's really kind of causing people to begin to go into those patterns, which ultimately will lead to their suffering or their illnesses.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, so you brought up one of my favorite topics is this examination a la Rudolf Steiner's lens of looking at these different opposing forces that cause problems and that we could attribute like satanic or demonic energies to. The Ahrimanic and the Luciferic. So the Luciferic is that which seeks spirit only and denies the physical. And here we are in a manifestation of the physical world. And there is a purpose to that. To deny it and to leave it causes problems. And there are some spiritual approaches that are very Luciferic. And I do think that in its dawnings, yoga was quite Luciferic in the sense that all the material plane is just an illusion and there's nothing that's real except for the spirit. Ergo, deny the flesh, deny the spiritual. And even in the Christianity, and there could be this idea of denying the flesh, right? So when all truths are half truths, there's a good aspect to the Luciferic in the sense that it is pure spirit seeking. But when it denies the physical, there's a problem with that. And there are also problems with the Luciferic. Like when we get very Luciferic, we can start to feel like in a sort of egoically enhanced way, I am God. Like I have everything unto myself. I don't need God. I am that God. I am a God, and it's sort of dark and a little ugly in that way, or it could be very ugly. The big problem today on the planet, though, is not the Luciferic. The big problem today is the Ahrimanic. And the Ahrimanic is the denial, as you said, of the spirit. It's pure physical seeking. And in medicine, it's a big problem, because it denies the spirit. And you know, the truth comes, you know, the hierarchy, it comes from the spirit, and then it comes down. As you said, the physical is the lowest form. And when we identify with the Ahrimanic, you know, there is a package deal. So you get, like, let's say you're being very Ahrimanic. Let's say you're really identifying with the body. Or let's say you're very, very stuck in a conservative way of seeing things. And that could be Christian, it could be Jewish, it could be Muslim. Like, this is the way the truth is. It says this, and therefore that's the truth. That's Ahrimanic, is to take the living form of God, which is only experienced through actual experience and not through the mind. It can't be defined or explained. It can only be experienced, which is a Taoist quote, right? And saying that's the truth. It's taking a word that's written down and attributing it with God. That's a form of idol worship, to say that the word of God is the way it's written. The word of God is beautiful, and it's we should exalt it and love it, but not worship it as if it's God's will itself, because that's a dead form in a fixed form, which Ahriman has his dwelling around. You know, as soon as a person starts to become dogmatic about the truth through the writings, they are sleeping in bed with Ahriman. And when they do that, they get the package deal, which comes with identity. I am a Jew, and all that means. Therefore, my thinking has to be as other Jews think, or I'm a Muslim, and I have to think how all Muslims think, or Christian. There's a prescription of thinking there, and it varies from sect to sect, from denomination to denomination. But when we identify with Ahriman in any way, and it could start with I'm a Jew and therefore I have to think what it says in the Torah. That's the truth. And these point. They're signposts. They're signposts. They point to the truth, but the truth is something they have to experience. It's leading horses to water, but the water must be drunk by the horse, and then the horse knows the water by the actual act of drinking, not by the signpost of leading it, right? So the serious problem today is the identity politics, because it is, first of all, because it's regulated and ruled by this Ahrimanic force. And it also is a limitation on the being. Whatever we append to I am becomes an Ahrimanic trap. It becomes a way of fixing ourselves to not experience the fullness of the I am, but rather, okay, so you are that. All right, you're using your mind power to you're weaving, you're taking a magic wand, because I am is creational. It's creative. It has power of words. It's the most powerful form of creation. I am, because it is creation itself. I amness. So you're saying I am gay. I am gay, or I am Black, or I am a Jew, right? This is giving a lot of power to that. And I do understand, I have compassion for the minority, because the minority has suffered at the hand of the majority for being different. And there is something celebratory about being a Jew, or being gay, or being Black, or these minority expressions. That's the half truth. Enjoy it, but tread very lightly on the identity aspect of it, because it's really, they're more superficial aspects of the self, very much more superficial, especially the color of the skin. And I do understand that there's a whole culture around skin color that's more than just the color of the skin. There's culture there. But if a soul is seeking liberation from the trap of identity, false identity, the trap of the physical, identifying with the physical, then this is important to grasp. Exactly how you set it up. Like this identity politics is problematic today. That's the working of Ahriman. And Rudolf Steiner says that Ahriman will prepare himself for his coming. He will prepare the world for his coming. And he said, first of all, he said that the Luciferic manifestation as Lucifer came 3,000 years ago through a Chinese man. Could have been one of maybe Lao Tzu or Sun Tzu or the Yellow Emperor. I don't know who that was, but he brought this amazing spiritual teaching, and maybe in a way which expressed the denial of the physical, right? And then the Ahrimanic is to come right now. This is the exact time that Steiner predicted 100 years ago that Ahriman would manifest as a physical being. And I think, I don't know who it is. I don't know if it will be a man or it's AI. It's like some manifestation of AI through an advanced form of roboticness, because there's a kind of a tangible body given through a robot. And if it has the mind and it's given senses, it might have perception of itself, and it's totally not a living being, but it could have a sense of like a God amount of knowledge, right? And thinking is also in the realm of Ahriman. So when we're thinking a lot, you're thinking, that's Ahrimanic. And so if we make like a symbol, spirit seeking as a triangle pointing up, and then physical seeking triangle pointing down, we have the triangle pointing up, we have the triangle pointing down. The Christ sits as the balance of those two. There's no denial of either, and then there's no fixation on either. There's a nice balance of the two. And this is an alchemical union, creates the Star of David, which represents the union of fire and water. And that's really what the Christ child is the balance of those opposites. So it's helpful to understand these forces, the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic, and also how they have served creation in a godly way. The Ahrimanic creates this physical realm. He's the demiurge that creates physical reality. Without it, we wouldn't be here. It's a beautiful thing. And then without the Luciferic, we wouldn't understand our spiritual nature. We would think we were just animals. So the points of evolution when these energies have come have been necessary and a required part of the evolution of humanity towards heaven and earth. Humanity creating heaven on earth. But when they manifest strictly individually as energies that are not imbalanced, they cause problems, and they attract forms of energy which we could call evil, demonic, satanic. When I was a kid, I was a teenager, or maybe in my early 20s, I watched a movie called The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Have you ever heard of that movie? It's a Hollywood production of a true story of a woman named Emily Rose, a young woman who was possessed by some really nasty demonic forms that were destroying her body. And it's Hollywoodized, but it's based on a true story, so it's kind of a horror movie. But in it, she describes in her journaling, or she says it in the movie, that she was given the choice to rid herself of the demonic forms, and she chose not to, in order to demonstrate to the world the existence of these creatures, these beings. And what happened to me after watching that movie is my faith in God. First of all, I went, holy shit, I've been new ageifying. I've been very new agey and overly positive about my relationship with evil. There is no evil. If there's no evil, there's no discernment between good and evil, between the true life-giving forces and the death-bringing destructive forces. And so when I acknowledge the existence of the evil, my love and admiration for God and the godly form of creation went out the roof. It really jumped levels. And that discernment was highly important for me. And I gave deep thanks to Emily Rose. She basically sacrificed herself. Maybe I'm the only one. I doubt it, I'm sure there's tons of people, but maybe I'm the only one. But she, in a way, saved a big part of my life there. And ever since there, I acknowledge it, and I've come to recognize a lot of half truths around what evil is, because it has a role. So there's a half truth that it is good in a way, but then there's a half truth where you just don't want to mess with it. You don't want to identify with it. You don't want to invite it, right? So that's yeah.
I mean, how do you feel then about that idea of like the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Because I think a lot of people, again, in this idea of in retrospect, it's very easy to see things, to judge things. We can look at past dictators or individuals, mass murderers, and say they were evil or they did bad.
Yeah.
There's a woman, Byron Katie, you've probably heard of her, but she has a very beautiful
Yeah.
quote, which is something like, if you believed what Hitler did, you would do just the same as he did. It's very easy to look back in retrospect, but it's very hard, much like for the individual, and that idea of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's
Yeah.
very difficult for us to see that in ourselves. Even during COVID, I mean, whatever people think about it, there was a certain energy of separation, like whether you were vaxxed or you were unvaxxed. The unvaxxed, I mean, even the president of the US literally said, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Like that's othering an entire group of people. It's in a sense demonizing, and it's saying all of the problems of the world are coming from this group. And that's a common motif throughout history and in many cultures, where you demonize a certain group of people, and all problems are because of that group of
Yeah.
people. And as you said, it's difficult because the minority usually is suppressed. I mean, that's the definition of minority, is they're less, so their ideas are less prevalent. But almost all of these, in retrospect, these bad ideas or these evil ideas were at some point supported by the majority. I mean, there's a beautiful quote by Arthur Schopenhauer where he says, I think very, very beautifully, that all truth passes through three stages.
Yeah.
First, it's laughed at or it's mocked. You know, whatever that is, the gravity. It's just seen as something ridiculous. Like who would actually believe that? But then, as more evidence comes out, he says it's violently opposed. And you see that throughout history. Like emerging ideas, revolutionary ideas, are usually violently opposed because
Yeah.
they break the paradigm. They break what we perceive to be the truth at that time. And he says the third stage is, in retrospect, they're accepted as if they were always true. And I think that's
Yeah.
very powerful because, there's a beautiful psychological experiment where, like a teacher will ask the students, like, is slavery bad? And everyone raises their hand. Yes, it's bad. Then the second question is something like, if you lived in the time of slavery, would you have supported slavery? And no one raises their hand.
Right. Right.
But,
Of
but the
course.
reality is the majority of people in every culture throughout history did support slavery. So you would have supported slavery, most likely,
Yeah.
unless you were one of the rare individuals who had a different cosmovision. But again, then that cosmovision would have been laughed at, and eventually, as it gained more momentum, it would have been violently opposed. But it's only many years later that in retrospect, we can look back and say, well, of course, like slavery's bad. We all know that. And yet we all didn't know that. And so,
Exactly.
it's an interesting thing. And I think also going back, like I think many people have seen that in religion. Like they've maybe seen the bad, as a generic term. And I think because of that, many people have shifted towards other cosmovisions, like, you mentioned atheism. But eventually there's a hole in that too. There's a suffering that comes in that too. And now I think also what you're seeing is also maybe a coming back to religion because
Yeah.
people also
Yeah.
realize that there's something that's causing them a deep suffering in that worldview that's, maybe the other worldview wasn't completely true, but at least that worldview is giving them a little more comfort than the worldview that they accepted. And so there's this
Right.
very interesting kind of dance that begins to happen from that.
Yeah, for sure. There's something called Overton, the Overton window, which is exactly this, like what's accepted. what's taken as value, as face value. And it does speak to the mass thinking of the way people mass think. And mass thinking is not a healthy point of view. Like, we should each be thinking as individuals, but in regards to seeking the truth. So yeah, there could be a mass thinking if we are all aligned with the truth, which is great, but it's emanating from the truth itself, and we're recognizing that rather than this mass way of thinking. And there's a really good quote. I love the quotes that you're sharing, and I might not get this exactly 100%. I forget who said it, but it's basically, it is said that it is said that men lose their mind in herds, but they slowly regain them individually. So the herd mentality is a powerful force. Like, we got to see that during COVID. Like, people were really getting really intense with social distancing, wearing masks, being vaccinated, where it was literally calling people out, like, you're killing grandma because you're not wearing your mask. You're killing grandma because you're not getting vaccinated. We saw this crazy amount of mass indoctrination and mass, herd animal people losing their minds, having this mind virus. And so it's very important for us really to think for ourselves. I think if there was a lesson in COVID for humanity's evolution, it's very important to think for yourself, because the authorities were completely misleading. They were making shit up out of the air just to serve the purpose of making the V solution seem like the only solution. Even in my profession, the governing bodies in naturopathic medicine were very much doubling down on, you can't talk about vitamin D. You're not authorized for that. That's what I'm trained for. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I'm trained to know the benefits of vitamin D in the prevention and treatment of viruses and other forms of infection and illness in general. But people weren't even allowed. There was a heavy duty amount of, I would say, because the truth is godly, deception is the opposite of that. It's evil. And in the Christian model, Satan is referred to as the Lord of Illusions. He's the Prince of Illusions. And it's true. That's his kingdom that he resides over. And so there was a very strong, that force taking over humanity that people didn't even realize that they were under the influence of. And it was all exactly what you said, like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So this was a susceptibility of people with good intentions. They want to do good. There's a weakness in their sense of self. So they derive a sense of goodness from doing these acts of good. Not, I am inherently okay. I have an inherent sense of confidence and worth. Not that I have to virtue signal and do these things that everybody else is doing in order to be good. That was the susceptibility that led people to be coerced through the, wolf in sheep's clothing. This is good. Do this. You're helping your fellow human. That was the spoonful of sugar that enticed people to lose their way and to get the mind virus. So that was a very interesting thing in humanity. And hopefully, I think a lot of people have woken up. A lot of people have woken up. And so it was, here's a half truth. It was good for humanity. It was meant to be. This is the half truth of things being meant to be. And people mistake it for being God's will. Everything that's happening is God's will. I think this is a half truth. And we have to acknowledge the other half truth, that there was a really dark element that happened, that if people had fallen fully for it, well, we wouldn't be in a very good place right now. So even though good comes out of the manifestations of evil, There's half truths there that you have to be very aware of. Not everything is God's will in that full spectrum picture. Yeah, I really think that's important for people to recognize. And you get a lot of spiritual people saying, well, it's meant to be, it's God's will. But there's a danger in that, in missing the evil part of it. So they'll say, well, God manifests through evil. Yeah, but it's more like it piggybacks rather than operates as evil. It's not operating as evil. I think evil has a role. It's given a role by God, but it takes its role very seriously, and it will bring humanity into ashes if we let it. And life is a principle of truth, not death. Death is to be accepted, and there's a beauty in it and all that stuff. But life is life, and death is death. They're kind of separate in this way of speaking in half truth, right? So, yeah, I think that's important for people to acknowledge. Yeah.
A lot of what you've been speaking about, you're referencing Hermes and Rudolf Steiner, alchemy, these kind of esoteric traditions. Could you maybe speak a bit more about kind of the role that's played in your life? Like, I mean, just in a very basic way, what are you referring to when you're referring to alchemy? I think people are probably familiar with Steiner, maybe to some degrees Hermes, but even when you were just speaking a lot during or about the COVID pandemic, about this idea of searching for truth within, that it has to be experiential, that it has to be found, it has to be sought after and found. I think these run also a bit antithetical to a lot of our education, which is kind of being taught or memorizing or accepting things rather than that more experiential alchemical process of going into the lead, being able to transmute it so that you can find gold. And that's why I was saying that there's a very big difference between understanding something or knowing something on an intellectual level. And I'm sure this is something you've experienced a lot in your practice, where you can tell someone something and they're like, oh yeah, I know that. But there's a difference between knowing it in the level of the mind and embodying it. It's a very different type of knowledge. And I think a lot of these alchemical or kind of more esoteric practices really put an emphasis on that. So maybe just from your own experience, if that's something you could speak about.
Yeah, for sure. Like just sort of talking a little bit about what alchemy has been for me and stuff like that. Yeah, sure. And then I'm gonna have to like part soon because I have a session coming up in very soon. So I'll keep it brief, and then maybe we could have round two one day. As you said earlier, we could probably talk for maybe days. It's really enjoyable unfolding discussion. So alchemy for me, some people will look at alchemy like what Carl Jung did as like a strictly metaphoric principle for the inner work. I like to look at alchemy as the inner work and the outer work, the lab work, laboratory, lavoro, which means to work, and oratory is to pray. So we pray while we work. And as we grow, our lab work increases. So the medicines that we make improve. And then we take them, and those medicines improve us further. And then that improves the lab work, and so on and so forth, towards this aspiration of marrying with God, merging with God. And there's a quote by King Solomon that about death. That death is, I have it somewhere. I wish I remembered it, but basically, in a nutshell, what it conveyed was that, death is an illusion. It comes from a believing one is separated with God. Because some of these yogis and Taoist masters and alchemical masters, and in yoga and in Taoism, there's a tradition of alchemy as a means of learning as a means of transforming the body and removing the lead of the body, so to speak, to know God through experience. In these traditions, there are people who have attained physical immortality. So there's a level of immortality that one realizes at a certain point in their life, that there's a continuity of consciousness and you never die. So death is just an illusion in that way. But then those people they'll invite godliness, the pure life-giving principle, into all their bodies and master all the bodies, give up their will on all the levels of the bodies, so that that eternal nature of God will become manifest literally down into the body. And that's my aspiration, and that's what I work towards. It is, very challenging. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm just going to sit and do it, and there I got it. I got the immortal body. There's a lot of very powerful things that one needs to align with before that can be possible. But for me, alchemy is that the alchemical texts, the traditional alchemy texts like Lapidus and Pursuit of Gold, the Book of Artifice. There's something that I call the Quartet, which is Ciliani's work on Hermes Unveiled. And then there's the Les Récréations Hermétiques, the Hermetic Recreations. It's a French book. So there's a French tradition, there's a Jewish, there's Hebrew tradition, there's Arabic, Chinese, and they all have their writings. And the writings are very cryptic, and they require deciphering. It took me years to even understand what was being said a little bit. And even now I'll read the text and I'm mystified in some ways. I don't know what the hell they're talking about. But it's all code word and it needs to be deciphered. And ultimately, I love the model of alchemy. For me, it's the culmination of all the other things that we're talking about. It's the sort of like the lead chariot that I like to bring forward in my life, because it's very simple in some ways. Like I've shared a lot of alchemical principles today about the union of opposites and half truths. It really helps us get deep into the understanding and the embodiment of the Christ energy, the Tao, through the union of opposites, through Sol and Luna, through the marriage of heaven and earth. The Torah, the first chapter of the Torah, the book of Genesis, and the first chapter of the book of Genesis is a purely alchemical prescription for making the Philosopher's Stone. It's mind-blowing when you start to know alchemy and you look at Genesis. It's incredible. And the first line of the Torah is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth. So it's all about heavens and earth. What does that mean? What does it mean, the heavens? What does it mean, the earth? How do you marry the two? What do you do? These are all the questions of alchemy, and I find it because I'm intrigued by mystery and like solving puzzles. I love that. So it's I've always been attracted to that because that's like abundant in alchemy. And in so doing, asking oneself questions and not to just externalize to the lab, because then that's a mistake. And I think, I don't want to say it's a mistake, because really the truth lives inside of us, in the self. But to say alchemy is only external, only internal, I don't agree with. I think that there is a beautiful, path of what in nature do we take to marry the heavens with the earth? How do you purify it? What is done? So that's really cool. I love that aspect. And if anybody has managed to get to the end here, I would love to invite them if they're interested in training with me, because I know that we're coming to a close here. Perhaps you could leave some links to my training program, and then we could leave some links also if somebody's interested in working with me personally. I also have health programs that I could work with. And you could contact me through dr-moshe, MOSHE.com. That's the easy one. And we'll leave the other training there. Or you could contact me to ask me about the training. So thank you, Jason, for that. I'm very grateful.
Beautiful. And if people are interested in your work or contacting you, that website is the best place to go to?
Yeah, that's a fine place to go. They'll be able to get through to me that way for sure.
Yeah. Well, Moshe, this was a pleasure. I really enjoyed kind of picking your mind. Where I am, it's 11:11, so that's a good time to stop. talking
Yes,
about
sir. Me
alchemy.
too.
But like I said in the beginning, I think we could talk for hours. So, at some point, I'd love to do round two. I think you have a lot of knowledge. You have a beautiful way of sharing it. So I really honor your work, your perspective, and I think people will get a lot out of this. So I'll put a link in the show notes, and please keep in touch. I wish you all the best. And again, thank you so much for coming on.
You're so welcome, and thank you too. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I really enjoyed it. I think he's a fascinating guy, really a wealth of knowledge of different fields, and being able to combine those and speak to them in really beautiful ways that really connect them. So I really hope you all enjoyed that. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good way. It's a website you can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, thank you very much to the people supporting that way. And if you're able to do that, it's really based off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's a beautiful way to support and to allow me to continue making these episodes. Also, if you are interested in working with myself and my colleague Merav Artsy, we have 2 upcoming plant medicine dietas in Europe, in April in Portugal and July in Ireland. It's a really beautiful opportunity to go deeper into this plant work. If you'd like more information about that, you can visit my website at nicotianarustica.org. And then finally, if you're not able to support via Patreon, always helping with the algorithms is really beneficial. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review is really helpful in getting this show out to a bigger audience. So I hope this finds you all well. In terms of my upcoming guests, I have a woman coming on named Melissa. She's a plant medicine practitioner, so I'll be talking to her about her work, her story. After that, I'm trying to think. Hopefully, I'm going to bring my friend Roman back on. We already did one interview together. He's the head of an institute called Paititi, which does really beautiful work here in the Sacred Valley. Maybe bringing my friend Andrew back on while I'm still here in the Sacred Valley. There's a Cerdo gentleman named Vitor who I'd love to bring on. Still trying to arrange all these. But as always, I hope to bring on some really fascinating guests. So I hope this finds you all well. Again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the support. And I will see you all on the next episode.